Hello, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed this set of talks today, and thank all of the speakers for their time for attending, and we'll now move on to Q&A. Today's theme was reliability and testing, and this is an area that I feel particularly passionate about. I think that there's a bunch of challenges in this space with large-scale distributed systems, and it hit particularly close to home with Facebook on October 4th when we had a large-scale outage that affected many of the systems across the world. And so it really goes to show that even for large-scale distributed systems, it's really critical to focus on how do we improve our lower-level infrastructure and focus on making our products more resilient and improve the reliability and testing across these systems. So thank you all for attending. We'll now move to Q&A. Our moderator is Jacie, and we'll now have the speakers here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. Hi, everyone. My name is Jacie Fan, engineering manager here at Facebook. I support two teams that provide request and system-level telemetry and help Facebook infrastructure scale in a reliable and efficient way. Well, first, I want to thank every speaker again for coming and sharing at system-wide skills. I really love how we have very different aspects of the reliability and testing. And also want to thank audience for submitting questions. I can see that there is a list of good questions. And it's not too late. If you want to do that, you can still do that through BlueJeans or Facebook Live. All right, so I'm gonna start with the one for the first talk, Behrooz. I have too many microservices. Where does the specificity of SLO start harming the org?
I think a good way to look at specificity of SLOs is that if you do have too many microservices, you can go one level up into like an API perspective. Like identify your most important APIs, and then those will naturally link pretty much one-to-one to services that are important, which means you're filtering out the large percentage of your microservices to just focus on the ones that you consider important.
Thank you. The next question is up for Paul. What you talked about different type of testing, and the question is, how does integration testing compare to canaries or baking for services?
Yeah, that's a good question. For those who don't know, canaries or baking, that's about replacing some of your production instances with a new version, which you're about to roll out or test. And the difference is that this new version will serve production traffic. So essentially, you're using your customers or your users as your testers, and if there's anything wrong with the new version, then they will see those problems. That's why we encourage integration testing whenever possible, so tests run before users can impact from potential bugs.
Thank you, Paul. All right, the next question is for Arun and Aliisa. Why did you pick Jest as the testing framework? Did you look at other test runners, and what were the evaluation criteria?
Yeah, so I can take that one. We basically know that Jest is like created by Facebook for one, but it's a de facto standard in testing. So there's a lot of documentation for it. It's really easy to run. Some criteria for our team was, since we have lots of PRs going through, we want to keep developers running quickly. So if they need to pick up a test, they need something that's going to be very easy to develop. It has code coverage with just a single flag. and it's able to run in our CI. So these are some of our criteria. One other that we did look at was Cypress, which Cypress is good for a little bit more end-to-end. So we looked around a little bit, but Just was really a good way to go.
Thank you, Aliisa. Cool. The next question will go to the first talk from Parimala, Raghu, and Sulav. So the question is, how did you design the battery backup time of 45 seconds for the service mitigation? Why not more or less? And I'm going to combine that with another question around rack batteries. And the other question is, are rack batteries isolated from each other?
Sure, I can take that one. So the first question, the second question is sort of easy to answer. Every rack has its own dedicated rack battery, so like rack batteries are isolated from each other. And regarding the first question about why we have 45 seconds of mitigation time, that's more dictated by hardware rather than software. Our present generation of rack batteries support the racks for up to 90 seconds after a power outage. And our data center backup power sources can take up to 45 seconds to turn up. So say there was an outage, for the backup generator to kick in, it can take up to 45 seconds. So unless we are sure that the backup has also failed, we don't want to prematurely fire PLS. So power outage happens, we wait for 45 seconds to ensure that no backup is going to come and save us, and then we fire PLS and execute mitigation for the last 45 seconds. Note, however, that like all our critical services can complete their mitigation under 45 seconds for up to an MSB-sized outage. For outages larger than that, like it's a to-do item, and we will take care of that in future battery designs.
Thank you, Raghu. Perhaps another question for you and your team. So this question is, do Facebook servers typically have problems booting up after power outage? And the person provided more context. They said, I have found in my experience that long-running servers can have issues that folks have not thought of around reboot. And this is typically problematic if you have thousands of long-running servers running a single application.
Yeah, I can take that one. So the short answer is no, we generally don't have any service. The longer answer is that after a power outage, when the power is restored, right, and all the hosts are restarting, what happens is we have this host configuration management system that tries to put the host into a known stable state, meaning that it will bootstrap all the processes and ensure that all the background services are running as expected. This can take a few minutes. Only after the host is in a stable state, it's marked as available for the cluster manager. For example, at Facebook, we have Join as the cluster management system. Only after that, Join then schedules any meaningful jobs on that host. So that's the general case. After power outage, there's definitely some chance of hardware failures. If that happens, at Facebook, we have auto remediation systems that regularly monitor for hardware failures on hosts. If they detect that the hardware has failed, they will try some repair steps that are predefined and try to repair that host. If even that automated remediation is unsuccessful, then we create a ticket to the on-site site operators for a manual inspection. So, yep, in summary, like we don't generally have any issues when we are recovering from power outage.
Thank you, Sulav. One question back to Arun and Aliisa. You talked about 100% coverage, maybe not a good target. Do you have a recommendation of a good target for test coverage? And do you plan to block merging when the threshold is lower?
Yeah, it's a definitely a very philosophical question, one that we probably won't enforce in PR merges for a little bit. There's good reasons that you may want to bring down test coverage if you're doing a big refactor. We don't want people to hold back code until it meets some arbitrary threshold we set. As it is, sometimes we struggle with big PRs. And I feel like waiting for bigger sort of like test coverage, more and more test coverage definitely will bloat that. So, to answer the second question first, we probably are not going to block. We're still setting up our GitHub Actions and all that stuff there, but we plan to allow if thresholds do go down. But we are planning to kind of monitor this as a code health metric, as a sort of a monitoring metric. Right now, we're in the 20 to 30% range. As we start to ramp that up, 40% plus in terms of branch coverage. We'll probably set a goal for about 75% is sort of what we're thinking about, which gives us sort of like the sort of the curve that Aliisa walked through, where you get to that point of diminishing returns. Feels like, at least anecdotally, based on my personal experience and based on the team comfort level, seems to be a good goal to hit by the end of the year. And then from there, we'll see sort of where we're getting the returns. Is it preventing the issues? Are people finding value in the documentation? The ultimate goal is to make sure that people are not creating junk tests or tests that are just there to pass the metric, like it needs to act as documentation or prevention. So we're still sort of like monitoring our behavior. As the team grows, it'll become even harder, where the first thing, if the new engineer onboards and their first experience is their PR is blocked because they don't have 90% coverage, that just sends a message that we care more about that than the code, right? So some of these cultural norms we want to establish in more, as the team grows beyond 10 engineers, we need to set this up in a more structured way. So I'm more stressed about culture than code coverage, frankly. So those are some of the things that we're watching as our guardrails as we scale.
Thank you, Arun, for sharing. I'm going to ask a follow-up question. I know both you and Aliisa have worked at different companies of different sizes. I wonder if your answer will be different if the question is about working at a company of large size. Yeah.
Certainly my answer is yes. At a bigger company, you have like a structured onboarding program. You'll have like potentially a platform team. You'll have better documentation, just because they'll have had more years of experience and years of, and just, other capable engineers supporting it with the proper tenure. So at a bigger company, some of these sort of systems are necessary because teams may not interact with each other as much, and things like automated fail-safes and like thresholds matter a lot. And so I would definitely encourage bigger teams to come and describe them in a friendly way, but certainly describe them and enforce some standards in code. I think anything that relies on human intuition and connection at scale definitely falls apart. So we're still in that sort of scaling stage. That's why you heard my answer differently before. But at a bigger company, I would try to accelerate that sort of time frame to get to that automation. I'll let Aliisa also provide her perspective.
Thanks. I'm thinking back to one of my experiences where I actually was working at that like tail end of getting really high code coverage, and the context there was really high scientific rigor. So I don't know if this is relevant to any big companies, but just this was having to do with space satellites. And so there's a higher necessary understanding that this code had to be passed every single time just for reliability's sake. So I would definitely mirror Arun's sentiment that at a larger company or a different context company where reliability is like heightened importance, that code coverage definitely is very important.
Thank you, Arun and Aliisa. All right, the next question is up for Paul. What are the benefits of having a dedicated integration testing framework? Couldn't you just use a unit testing framework with some tweaks? For example, run a service binary on the same machine as the test harness.
Yeah, so it is possible to use unit testing framework, and sometimes we do that, but there are limitations. For example, some services need the machine or the container to be provisioned in a certain way to start, or they need some dedicated resources like accelerator. So unit testing typically won't have framework. The unit testing framework won't be able to offer these resources. And it gets more complicated when you're testing multiple services together, because running them all on the same machine might not work. You might not have enough resources, for example. And well, ultimately, I think it has to do with test results being more accurate when the test environment is more similar to the production environment.
Thank you, Paul. Next question is for Ruth from Live. So the question is, how do you define SLO according to the period over time? Could either be refining lower or upper of the target goals. And is there a forum created with stakeholders, tech leads, and officers to set the target according to importance of the services?
I'm going to give a long-winded and very not so satisfying answer to this question, because the answer is going to be largely dependent on the organization that you're a part of currently. What I have seen for the most part is that when you have this first push of generating SLOs for services, especially for companies that are established, they have like thousands of services. They're going to go through this for the first year or two, and then the refining of the SLOs will slow down dramatically. What I have seen work extremely well in the past is when two teams are working together and there's an API that they've agreed upon, they actually set their SLOs there. So as an example, I was part of a team that we were providing a response to a revenue team of 25 milliseconds on P999. And they wanted it in 12 milliseconds. And then they wanted it within 7 milliseconds because there was a 5 millisecond network delay. So that was a conversation I had to have for a long period of time in order to get the correct SLO. And that, to me, was the best way to define the SLO. It was a client-facing agreement. What do we see in terms of refinement? For the most part, you are going to push your target goals up to a degree where I think Arun said the same thing about testing, which is you achieve diminishing returns. So once you achieve diminishing returns where you're going from 10 milliseconds to 8 milliseconds, who does that really help? How are you even measuring that? The cost of measuring the value now becomes. In terms of a forum or how do you establish these? There's a couple recommendations I can make. The best one that I have never seen, but I want to implement myself, is put SLOs into OKRs. So on a quarterly basis, you have to adhere to your SLOs. If you fail them, that kind of defines your roadmap moving forward. And your OKRs are presented to your customers and clients. So that's a really good way to kind of refine that over time. I have seen it work with like a panel of tech leads. For the most part, I have seen it work with a group of people that can be considered SREs or like the most critical people that during on-call. And they give a lot of opinion around setting goals. Once it gets to your directors of VPs, they really want to be told what the agreements are rather than trying to dive in and nitpick each SLO.
Makes sense. Thanks, Ruth. The next question goes back to Raghu, Sulav, and Parimala. Do Facebook servers have access to generators at the data centers after the battery power is no longer sufficient? If so, why is it necessary to take special actions on the servers when they are running on battery power?
Yeah, I can take this question. Yeah, we generally have redundancies like generators in our data centers. So these are the cases when even that doesn't work. Usually when you're transitioning from utility to a generator, it takes like 10 to 20 seconds for the generators to start up. That's when the batteries are used. And that's why the PLS system waits for 45 seconds before firing off this service mitigation execution path. So in case the generator transition fails, there is a certainty that the hosts will lose power. In addition, there are other electrical devices downstream of generator. So generator are usually big devices like several megawatts. There are other electrical devices downstream of that generator that can also fail, which affects a subset of racks within the generator. In those cases also, when those fails, generator usually can't help. And this is when the servers actually lose power, and we have PLS for any mitigating actions.
Thank you, Sulav. For someone like me who work on the software level, learning about data center and hardware is always fascinating. Thank you. Cool. I'm going to send one question to Paul. So the question is, in testing framework, we very often talk about BDD, behavior-driven development. Is it an approach taken in the internal testing framework for testing between services?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think testing services encourages BDD. The opposite of BDD is behavior-driven development. The opposite of testing behavior is to test implementation, and testing implementation is bad because implementation can change. You need to test the behavior, which is typically the interface. When you test the service as a whole, you automatically have to test the interface because you're treating the service as a black box. So integration testing and testing services as black boxes encourages BDD automatically.
Thank you, Paul. Here are two more questions for Arun and Aliisa. I'm going to ask them together. One is more general, any recommendation on test management tools? And the second question is there redundancy for automatic tools, more manual use / dev of tools to validate auto process?
Yeah, for test management tools, we're just going to use a spreadsheet to kind of just like write out the cases first. That's what we're doing. We're describing like the cases. At some point, there are probably more sophisticated tools that we may explore. So unfortunately, we're not yet at the scale where we need something beyond spreadsheets and just the lines of tests and code. Even at several hundred tests, I've not seen teams use sort of separate systems for these sort of tests. In terms of, sorry, what was the second question again? Forget now.
The second question is there redundancy for the automated tools?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely redundancy, and I think we kind of are going in with that sort of eyes open. Like we plan to continue using some of our load testing tools because it serves a very different purpose. We plan to continue using end-to-end sort of browser-based automation tools like Cypress because they bring in sort of a new component like the end user input. So definitely accepting redundancy. You're not going to get a comprehensive and exclusive sort of like setup here. Otherwise, you're just sort of overthinking it, I feel. So to me, there's defense in depth combined with you just want to introduce sort of different types of the tools that are best for the job, right? So Justin, what we saw with all the GraphQL resolvers we had is it's good at integration testing from the API level down to the database, but it's not good at simulating a lot of load or sustaining it in any sort of specific patterns. It's not good at fuzzing without us writing some security examples ourselves, right? So we use sort of separate tools for those sort of specific needs. and just accepting that there will be some duplication, but for the right reasons, we think. Aliisa, I don't know if you want to add anything else to the tooling side of things.
I think you covered it really well.
Thank you, Arun. One more question for Ruth. How do you recommend tackling ownership when there's a layer between engineers and production?
So in my talk, I kind of talked about the service catalog where it kind of showed who owns what. One of the things it's a silver lining about having a layer between your engineers and production is that layer needs to know when something is broken and they can't fix it, which engineers to actually go talk to, like which teams they have to go talk to. So that role of being the production reliability team, or like the SRE group, or there's lots of names for it. That role necessarily means they know who actually owns the services if things break and they can't fix it. So they will be incentivized to maintain a relatively up-to-date service catalog, even if it's informal and just really tribal knowledge on their behalf. You can use that data set to, again, find the owners of the services and kind of try to formalize that data set.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to send one more question to Sulav, Raghu, and Parimala. The question is, services typically designed for handling unplanned downtime for their instances. How much additional effort is involved in designing a PLS shutdown flow?
Yeah, I can take that question. As far as services are concerned, if their existing shutdown flow runs within 45 seconds, they have nothing to optimize for. The only restriction that we introduce from the PLS side is the 45 seconds that is imposed on us by the battery discharge time. So if their existing shutdown completes within 45 seconds, like they don't need to do anything different. But if it takes longer, they have to design a custom handler specific to PLS. Typically, how it plays out on Facebook is that stateless services are able to just reuse their existing shutdown sequence because it's not having that high latency, but like database services do perform differing shutdowns based on whether or not it's PLS. In that they prioritize, for instance, say shutting down primaries over secondary instances. So, yeah.
Thank you, Raghu. Here is one more question for Arun and Aliisa. What is the best way to combine manual QA team testing and automated testing for maximum confidence in every line of code?
Aliisa, do you want to start with this? I don't want to.
Sure. I don't know if I have a lot to speak to it, but I think the question has to do with manual alignment of a team of manual testing as well as testing in code. Is that correct?
Let me repeat the question.
Yes.
What is the best way to combine manual QA team testing and automated testing for maximum confidence in every line of code?
So
I can provide a little perspective, and feel free to jump in, Aliisa. When we kind of embarked on this, one of the things that I realized is the best tests that we could write actually come from looking at what we're testing manually, or what kind of tests that our manual process. That's why I started with the spreadsheet sort of as our tool, is we just sort of wrote down here's the variations that make us nervous. Here's the things that are high traffic code that could break. And I think it actually brings a pretty outside-in perspective. Rather than optimizing for code coverage, you're taking in a functionality-based approach. So I actually recommend that, to me, bringing in your manual testing routes and then picking off portions of it and automating it is the right way to go. And it provides that sort of natural boundary, or at least collaboration between the two teams if you're splitting them up. For us, small enough team that we kind of just do it all ourselves, both the manual and the automated part. So Aliisa knows this. Every time we ship a new build to the App Store for our mobile apps and stuff, we just all spend several hours just sort of sanity testing and running through a few scenarios, right? And then there's some things that are quite painful, and we know we would love to automate it, including things like just sample data setup, right? So that, to me, that approach has sort of given us a lot more confidence on if we automate it, it'll actually save us time versus the other way around of this is an easy test to write, and I just can say I have an automated test, right? So to us, like, manual testing kind of mindset is critical, and actually start from there and work backwards.
Thank you, Arun. I should mention that for other speakers, if you want to chime in for any questions, you're more than welcome to. All right, let's get one more question for Raghu, Sulav, and Parimala. Does Facebook use co-location, or does it own its own data center? If so, how does Facebook use Siren to coordinate with co-location providers?
Yeah, I can take this one. So basically, PLS only relies on the rack level batteries, and we have batteries even in the co-locations, so we don't rely on anything external to the rack. So whether it's co-location or our own data center, it does not matter.
Thank you, Parimala.
Yeah, if I may add a small.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, yeah, the difference between Facebook owned data center and a co-location data center would be that we don't own the electrical devices that actually fail in a co-location data center. However, like as Parimala mentioned, we have designed it around the rack level batteries. So still we can put those racks with batteries inside a co-location data and get that effect. Yeah.
Thank you, Raghu. All right, let me ask two more questions and we will wrap up the Q&A. So one more question for Ruth. When does using a service catalog make more sense?
Luckily, it's an easy one to answer. It really is it part of the ecosystem in your organization? Is it up to date? Are there good incentives to keep it up to date? And when you have those, service catalogs can be extremely useful and much more user friendly for your end customers, which are other developers. So for the most part, I'm I said don't use a service catalog if you don't have this data. But again, if it is up to date, it is a better solution than your on-call rotation, because the on-call rotation has noise.
Thank you, Ruth. So the final question, I'm going to ask both Arun and Aliisa and Paul. What do you do about edge cases? What are your philosophy? Maybe Paul, you want to start?
Yeah. So one thing we do about edge cases is fuzzing. It's great about finding things that developers haven't thought about. Just sending random things at the service will uncover weird behaviors, edge cases. And if you put edge case data in your random requests, like empty strings, -1, max sense, things like that, you will probably find even more edge cases.
And I'll add that I actually think edge case testing becomes quite easy once you write a few tests that are automated. It's pretty easy to kind of vary input length of fields. I've definitely caught bugs when there's just latency, and sometimes you just build systems that accounts for the human click latency, and the moment you start to automate it, it immediately breaks because something hasn't committed or something is too slow to read from somewhere. So I actually think you'll discover more edge cases just starting to write some integration tests, which is always good. So instead of sort of like looking for it, I think you'll actually create a lot of edge cases. The question then, becomes like, do you want to fix it? That's a different question. But I think the more interesting thing that I found is while writing integration tests, you're now starting to contend with questions like, should I introduce like a pause here? This API is returning an error. Should I work around it? And effectively, every time you're asking those questions, you've now encountered an edge case, and you have to decide what to do. So I actually always like recommend people writing automation tests, like don't fall into that sort of trap of blindness where you're effectively ignoring the edge cases being presented to you, and actually document it or decide what to do about it. So I'm a big fan of the writing tests for that reason, because it actually illuminates existing edge cases quite well.
Thank you, Paul and Arun. Oh, yeah, Aliisa, go ahead.
I'll be really quick. The only thing I was going to offer is just a little bit more detail on what Arun was saying is kind of how we're doing it here at Big Spring, with edge cases being kind of those bugs that you run into. And as we grow our customer base, as we continue to see more of those edge cases come to light, that's when we just jump in and add a test. So pretty much a restatement of what's been said.
Thank you, Aliisa. And that was our last question. Thank you, every speaker, for coming to System at Scale, and thank you, audience, for joining us. There will be another series of talk next week. Please come back, and we will see you next week. Thank you, folks.